Foreman is founding faculty director of a team that makes up the Colored Conventions Project, which brings, quote, buried 19th century Black organizing to digital life, end quote. Through the project's curriculum and its more than 20 international teaching partners, since 2013, over 1,700 students across North America have been involved in original research that is drawn upon for exhibits featured at coloredconventions.org/exhibits. The project has received awards from the MLA, ASA, and Popular Culture Association, as well as the American Culture Association, and was selected as an NEH Essential Project past and present. It has thankfully received support from the NEH and Mellon Foundation. Alongside team members who began as graduate student co-founders, Foreman is editing the forthcoming collection, Colored Conventions in the 19th Century and the Digital Age, the first edited volume on the movement. Foreman is author of 3 books, in additions with 3 more in various stages of completion, including The Art of Dismemory, Historicizing Slavery in Poetry, Performance, and Material Culture, and Praise Songs for Dave the Potter, Art and Poetry for David Drake. She is co-PI on an NEH grant that funds a recent graduate initiative in African American Public Humanities. She is the Ned B. Allen Professor of English and Professor of History and Africana Studies at the University of Delaware, where she's been recognized for her teaching and for leadership in institution building, diversity efforts, and community partnerships. Today, she will comment on the keyword principles. Denise Burgher is a dissertation fellow with the Mellon Scholars Program in African American History at the Library Company of Philadelphia and an English PhD student at the University of Delaware. Denise's interests are in Afro-Protestant women's literature in the 19th century Atlantic world. She is the chair of the Historic Churches and Community Engagement Committee for the Colored Conventions Project, a Colored Conventions Fellow and a Fellow in the African American Public Humanities Institute. Her dissertation is entitled Redeeming the Banished Spirit, naming the theological praxis in 19th century Black women's writing. Today, Denise will comment on the keyword iteration. Words are so exciting. Datejie is an independent scholar, strategist, and journalist based in Toronto, Canada. She has managed projects and startups, educated adults in collective advocacy, anti-oppression, social innovation, critical journalism, and unionism. Datejie has coordinated participatory action research projects, innovating decolonial protocols and practices for outreach, interviewing, data management, and transcription. She has co-led archival and history preservation projects, including Eritrean oral poetry, Northside hip hop, and the history of the Ontario Federation of Labor. From 2013 to 2015, Datejie led freelancer organizing at the Canadian Media Guild and sister locals at the Communication Workers of America, addressing digital technological disruption. She was 2015 Asper Fellow in Media at Western University and co-coordinated the 2017 Organizing Equality International Conference. Datejie holds a Master's in Environmental Studies from York University in Toronto and has recently joined the Colored Conventions Project at the University of Delaware. Today, Datejie will comment on the phrase communications as organizing. Next, we have Shirley Moody Turner, who is an Associate Professor of English and African American Studies at Pennsylvania State University. She teaches courses in African American literature, Black print cultures, critical race studies, and folklore studies. She has published numerous works in these areas, including her monograph, Black Folklore and the Politics of Racial Representation, and is currently the volume editor for African American Literature in Transition from 1900 to 1910, published by Cambridge University Press. Her current book project, privately printed, Anna Julia Cooper and the Gender Politics of Black Publishing, takes the case of Anna Julia Cooper to help make visible a, quote, shadow tradition of Black women's writing that exceeded the bounds of conventional publishing protocols. She is founding director of the Cooper Du Bois Mentoring Program, and in 2017, she worked with Howard University to digitize Anna Julia Cooper papers held at the Moreland Spingarn Research Center. In spring 2017, she was a national teaching partner with the Colored Conventions Project. Today, her comments will be on the phrase, quote, collaboration as resistance. We have Jim Casey, who is a research associate at the Center for Digital Humanities at Princeton University. He is a co-director of the Colored Conventions Project, co-editor of the essay collection, Colored Conventions in the 19th Century and the Digital Age, and working on a book titled The Invention of Editors, Craft, Collaboration, and American Literature from 1740 to 1872. His interests and experiences cover many areas of public digital humanities, including crowdsourcing, social networks, Douglas Day, and co-teaching Black DH summer courses in the past at Hilt. And we hope you guys go to Hilt this summer too. He is also in the early stages of 2 new projects on editorship studies and visualizing the activist and organizational networks of the early Black Republic of Letters. Today, he will comment on the keyword infrastructure. Finally, we have Brandy Locke, who is in her 3rd year of the English PhD program at the University of Delaware. She is an African American Public Humanities Institute Fellow and a Colored Conventions Project Fellow. In CCP, she is co-chair of the Digital Archives and National Teaching Partners Committee. Locke teaches first-year composition to the UD Scholars, a cohort of first-generation Delawarean undergraduate students. She currently interns with the curator of African American collections at the Stuart Rose Library of Emory University. Her work focuses on the relationship between African American women who formed intellectual communities to theorize about the intersection of race and gender as it shaped their notions of freedom, citizenship, and the project of racial uplift. And Brandy will begin our discussion today.
Actually, I'm going to have our panelists go ahead and start first, and then I'll moderate the questions.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Dr. Foreman.
How's everybody doing? Are you in that like happy, tired space? Yeah. I think this gives us another opportunity to just to thank all the organizers who have put this together for us, and so we can do that. I wanted to say something about to start, but being in an embodied space with all the people that we see and we know in our daily lives, in our Twitter lives, and so many of our lives, but being in this embodied space and being around beautifully embodied Black people particularly, not being in a field with you, right? Because we're in our own individual spaces, often alienated, often isolated, but instead being in rooms with you where the brilliance comes out of bodies and movements and braids that look like us, and shapes that look like us, and responses that feel like us, has been not just a gift, but also an intellectual and organizational intervention, as we all know. And for me, in the Colored Conventions Project, why you gotta be all loud like that? Let's turn that off. All right. For me, in relationship to the Colored Conventions movement, it's allowed me to start thinking about what we haven't accounted for at all, which is what it meant for 7 decades of Black people to be able to come together and experience the joy and the fatigue of the 4-day meetings, the 5-day meetings that we had never asked, right? But during the keynotes today, I was like, oh, what about that pleasure, right? I mean, what about Douglas and Garnett and Charles Ray and the editors being in rooms together when they usually were doing their political work in rooms that were completely, I better turn this timer on. Okay, all right. Okay, because I tried to steal a minute, right, by doing all of that before I got, oh shit. All right. So, that all those people were in rooms together where they got to enjoy being in that political space, and now I better go on and say what I got to say, all right? And not only that, in the hallways, in the boarding houses, and in the hotel rooms where Black women were so important in that infrastructure as well, right? Even though we look at these podiums and we're not accounting for all of that other work. We often root the genealogy of the Colored Conventions Project by sharing that it had been founded in a graduate, I'm working on somebody else's computer, so this is going to be a little bit confusing, a graduate seminar on Black literary history in 2012, where I had assigned, I used Facebook to make some assignments because they were using some interesting plugins to deal with social networks. And I thought, oh, all right, we can just put the delegates of the conventions in. And then Jim Casey said, after we had done this interesting thing, he said, oh, but why are we using a commercial site, and did a whole capitalist, right, and, you know, sort of critique. And instead, we should be moving this to an educational site. And Sarah Patterson, so we should give her a collective shout out for those of us who know her. And Sarah Patterson said, what about black women? And that's how the project, that's the genealogy of the project we tell all the time. I want to tell a different genealogy real quick about the fact that we really met for the first time at an Occupy Wall Street protest, where Jim was marching in the D.C. to New York, New York to D.C., and Sarah and I were holding a very, very big banner in some very, very hard rain, and then the three of us spent all evening washing clothes to make sure they were dry for the folks to go the next year. And then we had our first vote in that class at Harper's Ferry, and this is the week of Harper's Ferry. This is the week where black people died along white people, and they included Dangerfield, Newby, John Copeland, Shields Green, Osborne, Anderson, and Lewis Leary. We'll call their names because we do that because we listen to Jessica Marie Johnson, because we learned from that practice and its beauty. And so those folks died, and we took that meeting at that vote and debate at that meeting at Harper's Ferry, and that's how this project was also born. There's always multiple genealogies. I think it's important to tell them, because whatever collective decisions and commitments structure what we do, they're responsible for the success, or whatever success, that we may have had in honoring. That means archiving and analyzing the work of the intellectual and activist ancestors whose organizing for voting and legal rights, educational access and justice, fair wages and labor rights, and safety from state-sanctioned violence or apathy in the face of the continuing targeting of black bodies, lives, churches, businesses, and communities is an ongoing, continuous thing that makes the Color Conventions movement relevant today to us. And the denial of the continued requests, advocacies for inclusion that I think we need to account for in our political process, right? That folks been asking politely in political structures, been petitioning not politely, have been organizing for years, and I better pay attention to the clock. So today I want to talk about 4 of the organizing principles which guide our work, because we go back to those organizing principles to structure the work we do as a project in relationship to the movement. They are inspired by value statements like myths, but also organizing principles like the Jemez Principles for Democratic Organizing in Environmental and Economic Justice. We at the Color Conventions are developing now principles we'll be making public, so these are in process, that have undergirded our work for quite a long time. But we want to actually think about the ways in which we can structure them and then move them through our committee structure to analyze and make public the ways in which we function as a collective. So I'm not going to say out loud what you can read, but I am going to move down a little bit. Y'all got this? Can I keep on going? And this is just 4 of 6 that I'm going to feature today. The digital ones we'll talk about at our next conference. All right? And I want to talk about this word scholarship too, right here. Black scholarship, both black scholars who are, Lord knows we're hip, but also black scholar, which came over on the ship in the wake, right? And the ways in which I really do want us to think about where black scholars fit in black scholarship, right? I want to continue to use this formation instead of just talking about black scholarship in a moment where we're being erased, I think, that makes this gathering so valuable, because we're being erased from our own fields in so many ways. And I want us to attend to where black scholars fit in black scholarship. So that slash right there is important, I think, to our political practice, all of our political practice. I think we need to attend to that slash and all of the historical meanings it takes on. All right, so what does this look like? Here's principle 1. We have joint leadership. The project was created by no single person, right? And we want to move that through our press kits and FAQs. So when we thank the organizers here, they're always saying this was a group. It wasn't just me, right? There is no one leader right here. This is collective practice work. We love when the press is interested, but we ask that they interview at least 3 people. So the senior faculty person doesn't always end up in that position. right? When we're invited to our works or our talks, we try to include 2 members of the project team. We ask people to do that. You'd be surprised how many times they say yes. You'd be surprised how many times they pay for their yes, right? If you ask people and tell them it's connected to your principles, yes. I like her clock better.
Yeah,
then right, that works. All right, and then we go on, but I can't talk about that. Our teaching partnerships, our second principle was about including women in an institution and a movement that they helped to create, but have been excised from. So we are deeply committed to that functioning of reassertion of their labor, intelligence, organizing strategy, and infrastructure into the work we do. So when we are working with our international teaching partners, we have an MOU with those teachers, and that MOU says that they will attend to issues of race and gender equity, that they will have a connected woman like a wife, sister, daughter, fellow church member, friend, etc. This is Denise Burgher's exhibit where you see the tab here on Henry McNeil Turner, but here is a full tab on black women. I see it, thank you. All right, and here is some of the work on women. So every exhibit has a tab, right? We've got 15 exhibits, there is at least one tab. Women are infused throughout, right? Questions of gender are infused throughout, but the delegates are almost all male, but we insist that women are included. We also have decided that we are not going to think about professional development and job placement, which we have a very good track record of, in relationship to individual CVs and labor, but instead with a collective CV, right? So that we're not just doing an individual CV, but this is a collective CV. Yes, I hear you, and I am on my last 25 seconds. That here literally outlines the work of the people in the project, which is, I guess, 30 people, 40 people probably, labor is on this CV. The invited talks, which again are going to have more than one person oftentimes, right, because we're going to ensure that we ask that. The conference presentations that we do as a group, the community presentations, the workshops, the Douglas Day Transcribe-a-thons, the Douglas Day Press, which is actually not, just Project Press, etc. We wanted to put this together to show the collective labor and the collective work, and to again start thinking not about individual capital, individual advancement, individual work, but to honor in our principles the collective labor of the Colored Convention movement and the work that is, again, collective and collaborative and that takes some organizing principles in order to do honor to the movement that in fact we are, our project comes together to analyze, examine, and bring to digital life. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. As we've already been ably introduced, as you guys know, my name is Denise Burgher, and I'm the chair of the Historic Churches Community Outreach Program, a committee at the Colored Conventions Project. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us today. See, I'm trying. Thank you for joining us today. I would like to extend my grateful thanks to the organizers of ADHUM. I know you guys have already heard this, but it's important that you hear it again. Particularly the eminent Dr. Catherine Still Knight and Dr. Trevor Munoz, the ADHUM team and the MidLab team, and all the other people whose names I don't know. Thank you, because I know that this is a collective effort, and it took a lot. Thanks. All right. Can we take a moment just to give them a little collective love, just a little bit? All right, good. So the reason why, I know you saw Dr. Foreman do it, and you're kind of going to get tired of seeing and hearing it, but it's a principle that we practice, and we think it's important to always bring it forward. So as a collective that is devoted to bringing 19th century Black intellectual and organizing history to digital life, we are always aware of the work and inestimable value that organizers bring to any and every event, especially those who labor behind the scenes, i.e. women and other marginalized groups, including the people that everybody, I'm sure, left some money for in the hotel where y'all slept last night. So, using Douglas Day 2019 as a case study, I will discuss how we at the Colored Conventions Project have consciously taken on very valid questions regarding the hagiographic bent of our Frederick Douglass Day, which is our big celebration that we have every year. The elision of descendant communities by centering academic sites, which led us to think seriously about how we, a Black digital archiving project, need to question the role and function of standard knowledge repositories. Our willingness to engage in iterative processes allows us to respond to changing capacities and methods as we continue to honor the lives and the work of the organizers, delegates, and participants in the Colored Convention movement through the work of the Colored Conventions Project. So, not that y'all would be surprised to hear this, but the CCP uses an iterative process to guide and complete our work. This flexibility is possible because we're a fairly small core team and as a consequence of both the vision and the leadership of our founders, two of whom are on our panel today. Members of the team are allowed, in fact, supported to explore ideas and roles and test them for validity. We're not a rigid operation. As a consequence, not only are teams encouraged to work with other teams across our actual committees, but individuals can change teams if they develop an interest in or curiosity in another area of work. A team member may start on the exhibits team but want to learn about managing a database. Our note taker, for example, decided she wanted to make a film out of the clear blue sky. If you go to YouTube, you can find her pretty remarkable efforts in a short that was created to support the arts. It's kind of nice. Mobility is encouraged. The nimbleness of the project is evident in the choices we have made as regard Frederick Douglass Day. Frederick Douglass Day is our largest organized yearly event. Please come check us out. We're online. Conceived by Dr. Jim Casey, we originally began our first FD Day as a joint honoring of Frederick Douglass and a transcribing effort to bring people and attention to our CCP archives. As a crowdsourced project, we are completely dependent on the willingness of members of the broader community to transcribe our documents. At the time, we had a significant number of pages that needed transcribing, so the choice to focus on our own database, of course, made sense. We transcribed well over 400 pages that first year and saw the participation of 9 colleges and universities. The second year, we decided we wanted to expand our efforts, and we developed a partnership with the National Museum of African American History and Culture. We had a full program, 3 sites, and we just transcribed Freedmen's Bureau records. Last year, more than 100 colleges and universities joined us on Valentine's Day. 66 that we supported, 40 that joined us just to participate. Ask me about that later. Which is also Frederick Douglass, as some of you might know, chosen birthday. In case you're wondering, why do you on Valentine's Day? He chose Valentine's Day as his birthday. So that's where we get Douglass Day, right? We transcribed these records in a massive effort of what we came to call a day of radical love for Black history. But we had questions. Could we engage broader publics in addition to just the colleges and universities that we focused on? Having a transcribe-a-thon immediately limits the scope of your public. To participate, people either have to A, own their own computer. These are some of the ideas and the problems that have been brought up while we've been here. You have to have access to the technology, or you have to have access to a college, university, or library or community center which has computers and Wi-Fi, right, in order to transcribe documents that are online. This meant that by default, we were excluding whole groups of people. We did not want to exclude anyone, far less people who we wanted to work with, because they did not have access to technology and the support that using technology requires. So what are we going to do? Working with colleges and universities allowed us to focus on already organized groups of people and groups of people who were somewhat primed to be interested in 19th century texts. So what would happen if we changed our sites to places that were less exclusive and more community focused? What if we created a program which was not centered around using a computer, but instead used a far more basic form of technology, like a book or some other printed material? Luckily, we no longer had an enormous backlog of documents which needed transcribing, and we also knew that there are very worthy Black DH projects which need transcribing, i.e. the Freedmen's Bureau alone, which has millions of pages. So what could we do differently? The answers came pretty quickly. Because the Colored Conventions movement was at its base an activist movement, the organizers, delegates, and participants were deeply invested in achieving social justice for African Americans broadly. Dr. Foreman has already mentioned some of those things. So as a decentralized phenomenon, each Colored Convention meeting was shaped to the particular needs of its context, state, regional, and national. So we decided to take that on. We decided to shape our original Frederick Douglass Day to meet both our principles and our vision. So as a result, Frederick Douglass Day 2019 has become a readathon. We decided to focus on reading the words of Frederick Douglass. We would create, which we are in the process of doing, a curated set of texts. This list would be organized in 2 categories, a required reading list and a suggested reading list. These lists would be distributed ahead of time to participants in order to share his work with as many people as possible. The 19th century documents we've chosen are easily found online for free. For those unable to read beforehand, we have organized reading exercises for the day of. To be clear, we linked Douglass Day to Valentine's Day, as I mentioned again, calling it a day of radical Black collective love for Black history. We further decided to center the life, presence, and labor of Frederick Douglass's wife, the first one, Anna Murray Douglass, and the speeches of a few of the women whose public careers Frederick Douglass supported, by including texts by or about Mrs. Douglass, Frances E.W. Harper, and Hallie Quinn. We would not just continue to recognize an important aspect of Frederick Douglass, his support of women's rights, but also place him firmly into the context of a network of Black activists. Frederick Douglass therefore becomes a perspective, a cipher through which we can see a broader coalition of activists, particularly Black women, who fought for Black rights versus focusing solely on him. By redirecting our gaze from what Professor Gabrielle Foreman terms from the podium to the pews, we begin to appreciate the numbers of African American men and women who fought tirelessly alongside Douglass for Black rights. We decided to approach community organizations as hosts for our day, so therefore, the African American Museum of Philadelphia, also known as AMP, has graciously agreed to host our Frederick Douglass Day 2019, and we've begun developing our partnership through close conversation and planning with Ivan and one of his key staff members, Hannah. We further decided to bring contemporary work of current writers and poets into our FD celebration by organizing a spoken word poetry slam. We wanted to make sure that we not only shared the work and life of Frederick Douglass and the women whose lives he touched and supported, but to make organic, relevant connections with people wrestling with these self-same issues in the present. For the coming Frederick Douglass celebration, we intend to use technology to share the event by broadcasting, networking, and garnering feedback. For those, these of course are more traditional uses of technology. So for Douglass Day, our intention is to experience a richer and more broad community participation in multiple ways. Thank you. As a consequence of that, and this is last, I promise, we'd actually started these conversations before, but we are then going to leverage and transfer this energy that we're building a deeper and broader connection and coalition in the Philadelphia area to bring them to the Anna Julie Cooper project that we're going to work on with Dr. Shirley. Well, that's going to be transcribing. So the hope is to build capacity and then to move that entire energy to this next project. So, which Dr. Moody Turner is going to be able to tell you more about, not me.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm going to speak briefly, hopefully 4 or 5 minutes max, but I just want to start with a question to all of you. How many of you are organizers or have been organizers in your communities, in your school situations, anything? Excellent. Good. Okay. So reading the room, you all know what I'm talking about here. Communications as organizing is my keyword phrase, and the reason that I want to talk about that is because even in the context of a digital humanities conference, we can lose sight of the fact that the essence of it is communications. People wanting to be understood, people wanting to understand each other, right? And how do we actually communicate? For the people living in the time, working, hustling, running, escaping, hiding under the surveillance of a whole system of slavery that was still running after everybody's heels, even post-emancipation, organizing at that time meant an absolutely crucial emphasis on communications, and communications that could be trusted, communications that were reliable, communications that were specific, and communications that could have legs long after the people had spoken. So the power, impact, and longevity of the colored conventions movement would not have been possible without that kind of very, very intentional communications that movement members mobilized by using the black press and other striving newspapers of the day. Not only did they have access to or create and build their own printing presses, but they sought out who they could trust in other kinds of publications and newspapers, magazines. And the very first Colored Convention in 1830 that was held in Philadelphia was housed, hosted, mobilized, organized, and loved by the members of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church at Mother Bethel in Philadelphia. And the spiritual component of organizing, the spiritual component of those communications should not be lost on any of us in terms of the spiritual component of our communications today. So I just want to talk briefly about the fact that at that time, we have to imagine, I think really hard, given that how connected digitally we are now, that they had no electrification. They had no internet. They had no digital. All the communications was either verbal, it was by word of mouth, people doing things by handwriting, and in the case of the convention movement, what you had was a very disciplined, very organized movement of people making sure everything was noted down. And so when you go to the Colored Convention's website, what you'll see are the minutes from the meetings, or you'll see the reports from the meetings published weeks and months afterwards in newspapers of the day. And we are still trying to collect those documents. Anyone who comes across that kind of information, please send it to us. Looking at the Colored Convention movement and the parallel to the Colored Conventions project, we see that black scholarly organizing is alive and well, enlivening and extending these digital archives through all the ways that Dr. Foreman and Denise have already articulated. I won't necessarily go deeper into that, but what I want to say is that we have been maximizing the use of modern telecommunications and internet technologies, email, social media, live streaming, whatever we can get our hands on. Nevertheless, as Denise articulated around Frederick Douglass Day 2019, the point is still about bringing people together live and in person. Thinking forward into the future, the liberatory futures for African diasporic people still resides, I believe, wholly in the collective organizing potential, purpose, and intentions. And that also resides in our communications with each other. So even though many of us have very vast experiences, families, communities that we now connect with online through Black Twitter, through Instagram, through everything, we need to meet each other. And I always, when I teach, when I talk, I always say we have to imagine a world without electricity. Because the world we are in is under threat and in peril all the time. If something should happen, something radioactive, something anything, something that people might like to dismiss as conspiracy theories, we may once again be living in moments, whether it be moments, hours in a day that there's no power, or weeks out of a month that there's no power, or indefinite power outages. We may once again be without that kind of power. And I would really put it to anybody involved in anything digital to constantly think on those two tracks, to imagine our liberatory futures. What would they, what could they, and what might they have to look like if it was just mouth-to-mouth, word of mouth, face-to-face, handwritten kind of communications. In our digital communications, and I think this is the value of bringing forward the Colored Conventions movement and remembering and understanding the context in which they live, in our communications, in organizing and collective organizing, how to constantly remember it's about the person to person. I'll leave it there for our conversation.
All right. I get to work with some smart people. It's always fun getting to, we never actually have these conversations too, till we come to conferences. I want to share some of our other conversations that are really kind of common these days, where we're trying to sort of figure out how to do what we want to do, but also to think about how to do it without killing ourselves in ways that are sustainable, but then also that are about sharing and encouraging others to share the kinds of processes we figure out how to do these things, right? And so infrastructure I chose as my word just because I think it's the label that a lot of people are putting on these conversations these days about the ways that we can think about more than just, right, like power and lights and, a lot of formerly public institutions, which we can talk about. But to think about what is the infrastructure here, right? I mean, this conference sold out, right? I think that there's actually something significant to be had in the conversation there, right? Every one of these rooms has been full of people. And I also wanted to share, I just retweeted a second ago onto the conference hashtag, just a little Google Doc that we have been keeping for the past couple of years And we, when we started this work in 2012, we had a couple of great examples, right? Jessica Johnson's work, right? The Crunk Feminist Collective, right? All kinds of different wonderful projects. And we had sort of thought like, let's do our little literature review, a little environmental scan. We'll figure out what's out there, we'll get some models, and we'll sort of go on our way. And we felt pretty good about ourselves. We found 30 projects, 40 projects, give or take, some digitization efforts, some research, Tumblr, blog, social media, kind of fun stuff. And so we just posted it onto Twitter and said, if anybody knows the stuff that we missed, maybe there's one or two that there might be to talk about, maybe help us out, add it on. And today, I haven't looked today, but the last time I looked at it, it's something like 225 just hyperlinks out to projects, right? That there is this huge landscape of work that's in conversation with each other, in conversation across periods, across methods, across languages, that I think is worth thinking about as a kind of call to conversation about the ways that we might think about infrastructures as more than just kind of hardwiring things in, right? But how do we think about sort of wearing down some of the grooves so that we can help share, okay, we've been doing this for a couple of years, right? Let's make this available to other folks so that they can start, 2 miles down the road, right? Rather than us figuring out over a period of about 6 months and Googling how to make a website, which is a true story. That's the last part of that story that she told. And so I don't really want to actually speak for that long, except to express a willingness and an interest in these conversations about the ways that we can start to leave breadcrumbs or fill our pantries with canned goods, right? And to, think about some of the lessons with infrastructure that haven't worked out in the past, right? I was at a conference that was talking a lot about infrastructure a couple of weeks back, and almost every one of the speakers that got to be a joke was showing pictures of the freeways in the United States, right? This sort of massive infrastructure project, right? But when we think about those historically, we also know, right, they were a primary place for climate change to get accelerated. They were oftentimes deliberately aimed at breaking up communities, right? Specifically black communities in places like LA, right? And all kinds of places. So that it's not just about, can we figure out ways to put some documentation and tutorials together, that we certainly should. But I think there's also a big turning point right now where we have to think about the ways that the infrastructure is going to get built and account for the kinds of projects that show up on that Google Doc or not, right? And I think that I would love to hear from folks. We wanted to keep all our comments short in part to enable lots and lots of discussion. So I would love to hear thoughts and conversations as we move forward.
Thank you. So I want to add my thanks to the conference organizers, and just also add that is just absolutely beautifully done, like every piece of it. Wow. And I want to thank CCP for the work that they've done. Every time I'm hear it or I'm around it, I'm just in awe. It's really just so amazing, not only for the project, but really how the project is carried out. And I want to thank them for inviting me to join this panel. So I was National Teaching Partner for CCP in spring 2017, and as Denise mentioned, we're partnering for Douglas Days 2020 to work on transcribing projects around Anna Julie Cooper and Marianne Chad Carey, so we are really excited about that. I'm going to kind of read my comments, but I'll try to be lively so it'll seem like I'm talking or something, but and I'll try to go fast. All right, and I'm talking about collaboration as resistance. And we'll see if it works out this way, but if you can start with Frances Smith Foster and end with Andrea Williams, I think that'll be good. We'll see if I can do it. In creative collaboration, as African American as Sweet Potato Pie, Frances Smith Foster begins by recognizing that stories of African American collaboration, particularly the coalitions of artists and activists who worked in formal organizations and in informal communities, are less well known in our culture than are those of, quote, rugged individualists who succeeded against the odds. It is, as she asserts, quote, the lone figure, the fiery rebel, the single sojourner, and the inspired visionary who dominate our attention. Contrary to the popular or attractive mythologizing of the lone individual, the single author, and the charismatic black leader, African American writers, artists, and thinkers, as Foster reminds us, formed families, neighborhoods, organizations, and larger, sometimes international networks in which collaboration was a necessary and nurturing part of these enterprises. So working out from Foster's emphasis on collaboration, I just want to think a little bit about collaboration as a mode of generative knowledge production that can resist not only the historical valorization of the lone individual, but that can also offer us an alternative model for contemporary scholarship, pedagogy, and what Brittany Cooper calls intellectual activism. As my co-presenters have already discussed, CCP and the Colored Convention movement are rooted in the ethos and practice of collaboration through organizing and communication, through iterative practice, through shared principles, and through enabling infrastructures. As a national teaching partner, I want to focus my comments today on collaboration as pedagogical practice, as a site of generative knowledge production and as complex resistance. So quick context, in fall 2017, we signed on as national teaching partners. Our class was the gender politics of Black print culture, and we worked with CCP and Brandy helped us kind of figure out what we were doing, to identify our overlapping interests, and we began seeking records to document and contextualize Black women's participation in the colored conventions, and a little bit later focusing especially on the later part of the 19th century. For us, the very act of joining CCP as national teaching partners was in some ways disruptive to the more conventional approaches taken in graduate seminars, especially in literary studies. And I know this isn't like super sexy to talk about like disrupting the ways that we're teaching, but it's, you know, it touches most of the people in this room, is how, you know, how are we still approaching education pedagogical practices in undergrad and in graduate classrooms. So for us, though, to conduct primary archival research and to use that research as a basis from which to generate thesis topics and projects is not entirely revolutionary, or it shouldn't be. But asking the students to contribute to a shared resource to help generate and support future research was, I think, transformative. It gave them a chance to experience the production of knowledge as participatory and process-oriented, and to put theoretical concepts to practice. And then the students were also invited to read and comment on a senior scholar's work and provide that feedback. So it was Dr. Foreman's introduction to the Colored Conventions volume. And so it was, again, you know, it seems like a small act, but it was also of critical importance in inviting students to participate in the process of knowledge production. So I want to say just a little bit, I'll try to make it quick, that just 3 examples of what kinds of surprising discoveries were enabled through my students' participation in CCP. So, for example, the records documenting the 1883 Colored Convention in Louisville, as located and shared by one of my students, D'Angelo Bridges, showed that African American communities were far from monolithic, and that the conversations that took place at the convention, and then again through the Black press, cultivated an engaged, dynamic, and at times contentious Black public that held shared concerns, but often diverse opinions and approaches regarding how to address those concerns. So in one of the documents that Bridges located, the article identifies the 1883 Louisville Convention as, quote, the first representative national convention of colored men ever held in the United States. That's what he said. Because it included delegates from 27 states, and that even if it was missing the older leaders like Langston, Purvis, Weirs, and Still, they still had Douglas in attendance, as well as broad geographic representation from the younger generation who were, quote, formed in the mold of today's advanced ideas. So what documents such as these did for our class, and hopefully for future generations of scholars, was to provide an opportunity to attend to the nuance and complexity of Black intellectual thought and organizing, offering a very different picture than what one might get charting Black intellectual thought through touchstone figures or canonical texts. Another set of records centered around the 1891 National Press Conventions, located by Andrew Erlandson, document efforts to build a major early collaboration in the form of a syndicate that would, quote, gather and furnish news and illustrated plate matter for the sole use of the Afro-American press. The massive collaborative effort would help keep costs down and make the production and dissemination of news more efficient. This effort was criticized, however, by those who felt that it was driven by financial concerns and undermined the relationship between the press and its readership. The final set of records was located by Sabrina Evans and revealed some of the gender politics of late 19th century collaborations. In a report on the 1887 National Colored Press Convention, it is stated that Ida B. Wells was in attendance as one of only 2 or 3 female delegates of the 23 representing different newspapers. While Wells was elected as second assistant secretary at that meeting and was the only female officer, as Evans points out, the correspondent noted that he believed Wells has, quote, a brilliant and useful future opening before her if she does not suffer her head to become unduly inflated. So Wells, of course, would go on to become the center of another massive collaboration effort when the National Association of Colored Women in 1896 formed in part to answer the attacks on Wells by Missouri journalist John Jacks. The creation, and I won't say more about the National, I can talk more about the National Association of Colored Women after. So anyways, to close, my comments today are not meant to romanticize collaboration as a kind of utopian, conflict-free practice, but rather to suggest that a very different understanding of African American literary history and a very different critical approach come into view when we center African Americans' intentional, self-aware practices of collaboration as resistance. For my students, I think they came to see African American history as too diverse and expansive for one definitive edition. And through their work with CCP, they were introduced to a method and project that helped them get at the expansiveness, the messiness, the complexity, and the nuance of African American literary, social, and political history. So in closing, I want to turn to Andrea Williams, who suggests that as we carry out these necessary and massive recovery projects, we also promote and practice interdisciplinary collaboration, finding ways to create textured knowledge to situate and contextualize the materials we recover so that we might garner the critical, pedagogical, and public engagement necessary to enact resistance. So I would ask us to think about, as we engage in these recovery projects, how do we contextualize the recovered materials so as to make them meaningful? How do we build and encourage infrastructures of support to ensure that the materials are taken up in scholarly, public, and pedagogical contexts? So CCP offers one model for how to challenge the threat of what Williams calls post-recovery neglect by creating a broad, dynamic, social justice-based, collaborative, digital public humanities project. You guys do all that, right? So how can we use the lessons of CCP, how can we use the lessons that CCP has to share with us? Also, what kinds of things can't and haven't been digitized? What kinds of things escape or exceed digital practice? And finally, how do we guard against reproducing exclusionary practices in the Black digital humanities? Work in the digital humanities often requires, and I'm distinguishing there, work in the digital humanities often requires certain resources in terms of time, training, infrastructure, access, financial, and other resources. So how do we account for and remain sensitive to these types of challenges as we move, work, and strive for a more liberated future?
I'd like to actually begin by posing, is it okay if I stand here?
Yeah.
Good? All right. I'd like to begin by posing a question for our roundtable participants, and then I have a question for all of you, if that's all right. Y'all don't mind being put on the spot like that? Is that okay? Oh, no, okay. Well, we're going to do that anyway. All right. So, what I wanted to ask, sometimes it's hard to demonstrate the personal stakes in collaborative public-facing work, right? It can be intuitive, it can be really powerful, for example, like Marissa Parham's presentation today, right? There was a lot of work there that I can see in a scholarly setting, even at PWIs, being extremely moving and meaningful. But she brought her whole body, mind, and spirit, and ours along with it, to understand the stakes for her. And I'd love the participants to share with us. Maybe it's a moment, maybe it's an experience you had or a story you can share where the project's work for you intersected with your personal stakes in elevating Black histories of organizing, particularly in the 19th century. Maybe it was a classroom moment with a student. Maybe it was an activist moment where you were talking while you were marching, right? I think we've gotten a couple hints here and there, but I'd love for us to think through that as we think through the work that we do, and to really make sure we're checking in with ourselves in those times, right? That we are not doing this outside of our bodies. So is there a moment you guys like to share before I open up to other questions? I think Professor Foreman already started us off, so maybe a couple other folks might want to, or if you'd like to join.
No, I was like, thank you for skipping me. Go ahead.
It's a hard question, I'm sorry.
That's a good question.
I have an answer. I live in Toronto in Canada, and I've been crossing the border frequently to join with specific kinds of events and talks and meetings with the Colored Conventions Project. And for that, I have to present a letter to the U.S. immigration. What is my purpose coming to the U.S.? And I'm keenly aware that I might already be surveilled just for the work that I do with unions and social justice and whatever in Canada. But I'm putting it squarely that I'm going to work on a project that's about black organizing. Whether they catch the fact that it was 19th century, whether they make the interpretation that this is academic or not, it is about black organizing, and I'm aware of that, and so here I go. But it's a fraught moment. I've been put in their system simply because of the NAFTA negotiations ratcheting up who they're surveilling at the border. So it used to be a fairly decent given that you could just cross from Canada, you know, it's a friendly neighbor and all that kind of stuff, but that's not the case right now. So there's that scrutiny, and then there's the black organizing scrutiny. So that's just one case.
Thank you.
I'll wait.
I have a favorite thing,
Go for it.
and that's birthday cake. That we every year celebrate the birthday of Frederick Douglass, and we don't want to just completely nerd out on it. We ask, you know, we supply programming, and here's a template for your flyer, but like, also go get a birthday cake, because we're going to sing happy birthday, and if you can't, go to a black bakery and, you know, spend the money according to what we're trying to prioritize here. And it's just fun. I mean, I think, you know, lots of the histories that we deal with can be discouraging, they can be heroic, they can be things in between, but also just having birthday cake and lighting the candles, which usually it's in libraries, so we can't. But getting to sing happy birthday and, you know, see all the photos showing up on Twitter of people who have Douglas's face or a quote or, you know, something cool on the top of a cake, I think opens up a lot for us around just ways of having fun with the work that we do. You know, I thought the conversations about joy this morning, you know, are ones that I think we're always striving to make a larger part of the work that we're doing.
So not to be Debbie Downer, but it's not going to be about birthday cake. I thought about that question before, actually. And so part of what I do on my committee is I try to make legible the ways that the Colored Conventions movement is relevant to churches, community groups, book clubs. One of the things I'll say is anyone who invites me, I'll come. And I'll figure out how to connect the Colored Conventions Project to whatever it is that you do where you are. And it works. And so having to actually think with and to present to a diverse group of people, from Quaker Friends Societies to League of Women Voters to the Y, the Wilmington, the Downtown Y at Wilmington, there's always a moment where the power of the work of these 19th century activists resonates. Like, you can see it on people's faces when they get it and they understand why it's important. And that moment, and then they'll come up and they'll tell you stories about their ancestors, or they'll come up and they'll tell you stories about their relative who was a union organizer or who was organizing around voting, or tell you about a diary. And I've had that almost every single time where we've gone out and we've given these presentations. And so it's usually not a fun, like, feel-good moment, but it ends up feeling powerfully empathetic, if that makes sense. And so, one, it's seeing that moment of connection on people's faces, and for those of us who teach, you know what that looks like. And it's equally satisfying when you're giving a talk about the program to whoever. And then afterwards, the conversations that take place where people are able to make these organic connections to the work, because now they can see themselves and or their family members in the sweep of history as a consequence of being able to make a connection to the project. So, yeah.
I came up with my moment. No, I was thinking, it's not, you know, again, it's not maybe the most earth-shattering, but this is my moment. When I was doing my first book project, I actually did my doctoral work here at University of Maryland under Mary Helen Washington, who was a Cooper scholar. And I knew about Cooper, and I had read about Cooper, and I talked to other Cooper scholars. And I was doing my first book on black folklore, and I found Cooper talking to black folklorists in the late 19th century. And that was this moment like, what? Like, what is she doing here? Like, nobody's ever said that. I've never seen that anywhere. You know, and it just literally, it started this whole kind of, why don't I know this? You know, and like, what else don't we know? You know, and that really kind of, to set it off to thinking about like these long, complicated lives that these black women who, you know, Cooper wrote A Voice from the South, right? But like, what else did she do? She wrote till she was 105 years old, so what did she do in the, you know, 78 years after, you know, A Voice from the South? And so that really was one of the moments for me that kind of propelled this current work.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I want to add mine because it involves you, Professor Woody Turner and Professor Foreman here. When I gave my first professional talk, which was at Howard University, about the intersection between the Color Conventions projects, histories about women's organizing as it intersected with the newly digitized Anna Julia Cooper collection housed there, I was asked a question that I never imagined being asked on a symposium panel, which was, you know, what in your wildest dreams do you see being the change that your work ushers in, right? And I said, whoa, okay. And I realized in that moment, it was the notion that black activists, folks fighting right now for black lives to matter, to be liberated, might actually know this history, might actually find those voices in some way empowering, useful, able to embody what they're experiencing. There were moments at that point where Mamie Till's name had been evoked to embody what black women activists were feeling in that moment. And I wondered, what would it have been like for them to evoke Mary Ann Shadd Cary instead, right? What would it mean for them to see themselves as part of a history that is much longer, a movement that's much longer and has more for them to feed those energies and that labor that, you know, maybe activists today don't know is there for them, right? That there is this connection that we feel as scholars to the work that they do and the support that we want them to have. So that was a transformative moment for me, and I just really thank you guys for sharing that. And now, yes, go ahead, please.
Oh, yes.
Please.
So I'm really interested in the ways in which we can become advocates in our work and displace the model of individual achievement and think about redistributing wealth. You were talking about this earlier, Dr. Johnson was talking about this earlier, about the ways in which many of us have throughout our lives and then in this space, about how we can squirrel away and take resources and give them to folks who have been excluded for so much time. So one of my moments was the moment that I was able to walk in and negotiate 7 color convention fellowships for graduate students with a $7,000 supplement on their stipend and professional development money and summer money. That was a moment, right? So that was a moment. So, and I have found that when you ask for stuff for yourself first, they give it to you and they don't believe that you actually want the other things, right? So they try to buy you off, right? They try to pay you off. They're like, oh, well, we'll give you that extra $30,000 in your salary, but I'm not going to give you all those fellowships because you know then those other people will ask for fellowships. So I try actually to put the stuff I want for the collective on first. And I only talk about what I want for myself after they've said yes to all those things, right? So I just want us to think, the question I would pose is how can we be conduits for economic change in a landscape that is continually impoverishing us in so many ways? I would ask that question. And then another moment was when a sister named Carrie, oh help me out, Evelyn Harris was running against a Democratic representative, Senator Carper, in my state. And she is a progressive, and I was sitting there listening to her talk about the fight for 15. And realized that I had been feeling really good about how well we pay our undergraduates. And how that well, right, was actually poverty wages, and right? And that well was actually encouraging student debt, right? And that once my administrative assistant told me that the NEH insists on federal amounts that we were paying our students under, all right? So we were paying them $10 an hour, you're 10, something like that, right? So, and I went, why can't we pay them $15 an hour now? So we raised our undergraduate student wage to $15 an hour because they are in debt. I've seen the studies, we've seen the studies. There are things we can do, right? And then we thought, well, why don't we, the convention movement works on labor rights, right? Why don't we mirror the Color Convention's focus on labor rights and Black economic health and seek to structure and support and honor the work members bring to the project through equitable compensation, acknowledgement, and attribution? Why can't we do that? Now, it's really hard to do that because all the systems are about us being, quote unquote, responsible administrators. It's about the ways in which we are surveilled, and we fall short. We're having a really hard time with datejie because she's not a student. She doesn't fall into the model I know how to advocate for, right? She doesn't fall into that model, right? But we can do some things, and I just think we should try to do those things and redistribute wealth. And that wasn't a particularly pleasurable research moment, I've got that, right? But it's a better moment to share in this group because, again, if we can think about the collective ways in which we can stop student debt from impacting the small amounts of students that we impact directly, right, then we can make a difference. And then think about the ways in which we can use that to replicate and fight and advocate, right, in much more policy-driven ways. That's my moment.
All right, so now you guys. I'd like to, of course, open up to any questions that you have, but I want also folks to feel free to share what they felt from this presentation was particularly useful to you. Maybe it's a digital project that you're thinking of, maybe it's one that you're already in, or a community that's engaging with digital spaces and platforms in which what we've done is relevant and useful. We'd love to hear about how we are relating to the things that you're doing. And also any questions you have for us about what it is that we've done, anything that we've presented that maybe a little more clarification, explanation, or some certain questions would help answer things that you're asking of yourself, right? We're all about leveraging our knowledge collectively in order to work across and with other communities that are doing this work too. So, who'd like to go first? Go ahead. Oh, feel free to give us your name.
Oh, okay. Marcia Black. So I have a question about, are there any collaborations that are already happening with the Movement for Black Lives, organizations or organizers with the Movement for Black Lives? I thought your comment about calling on ancestors was really moving because that is a practice that we do to prepare ourselves, but also just as a community healing thing. So yeah, I'm wondering, are there collaborations?
So right now, they are not explicit, right? We include not only in that kind of a calling out practice and intentionally positioning ourselves in the way that we make presentations, et cetera, but we don't have any explicit organizational connections to Black Lives Matter. We tried, because part of what we discovered is that Black Lives Matter is very centralized, so we reached out to Black Lives Matter, decentralized. So we reached out to Black Lives Matter Delaware. There are 2 Black Lives Matter Delaware, and one is super different from the other and kind of didn't come together. We're like, okay. So it's definitely something that we want to do. along with it, we have a list. We have a wish list of other organizations, including BYP and others that are alike. So if we can talk afterwards, if you have something, that would be great. Because when we, like I said, we definitely reached out to Black Lives Matter Delaware, and
Let me put a geography matters so much, and one of the things that is really important about the color conventions movement is we see that, right? That kind of heterogeneity, that kind of local site-specific work. I lived in LA for many, many years, and my organizing work comes out of a place where there is loads of advocacy, social change, right, work. Delaware is run by, the state where we find ourselves is really sort of on lockdown by lots of corporate entities. This is being live streamed, right?
yeah, it is.
And I love my university, and my dean is just really wonderful. And I mean that. And my provost and president too. And I mean that. But where DuPont, right, they're really big players that mean that a robust social change
Exactly.
is not what has happened in the state. And so that was one reason we went started to move regionally, right? So we're moving into Philadelphia so we can think about those kinds of connections in a very different kind of way, because it's organized in a very different way. So thinking about the ways in which local, and municipal, and then digital, right, spaces function, and also thinking about the people who do this work so well. The activism organizing conferences that datejie held, that we have been participants at, that Jessica goes to regularly, and that we've had students go to, right, is one way that we've connected. But that's so very different than organizing on the ground and connecting to the actual organizing principles that are happening on the ground. And that's a place where we've really sort of created a community for ourselves, because we can't get to those places that actually sustain not only the Black lives that are imperiled, but our Black lives as people who need collective collectives to feel purposeful and connected, right? And the photo you saw is what you can get sometimes in a space that is otherwise a PWI space that is not even thinking about those sort of larger organizing issues. I don't know if that helps.
Oh, awesome.
Hi, my name is Leslie K. Jones. I'm a Penn PhD candidate. I am on the market. I mean, we're trying to actually, our intergenerational wealth is like a real thing. So like, I actually need a job next year. So that's why I love this conversation that we're having. But my question was about whether color conventions does or has considered using auto-ethnographic data of the participants in the project and compiling that sort of in sort of the style or the vision of the original color convention project of documentation and making that available. I feel like that could be a data set that you all create that creates like opportunities for rereading text. And I, as like a digital ethnographer, think that that would be a great tool for me personally, because I think that there's probably some things that you are doing that you have intuited from this literature that we all read and are familiar with that can be excavated and like create a model for us as like developing community intellectual projects.
Didn't you say you were looking at a job at University of Delaware where you would write that piece?
Where actually I would write that piece and hire a team of undergraduate students and teach them how to do digital ethnography.
There you go. That's collaboration right there.
That's what we're talking about.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I would just add to that we do have, well, not in the ethnographic sense, but we have done, one of our interventions is actually working with students on genealogical work in order to create biographies of the attendees, and the way in which that highlights some of the anonymized women is so important. The fact that this kind of profile doesn't exist of these people, but an ethnographic sense of that work, data sets being expanded and brought into the conversation. What we have is exactly the kind of collaboration.
And just to put another level on that, all those women who are invisible didn't take time to write, or they didn't take the time to write because they were busy doing this work.
Yep,
Nobody wrote
exactly.
that. And so like, there's women up here on this table who in 100 years may disappear from the narrative without that archive. So I just want to make sure that you all get your credit.
Or lessons learned.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Thank you guys so much, as always. Color Conventions, the collective, for all the work, and for you guys individually. You guys are such a model that I try to follow and think about when I'm thinking about doing anything digital or online or community related. And in that spirit, so this is now the third sort of project that I've seen here, and I've been bouncing through a lot of different panels, so I know I'm missing some. That is working so intentionally and with so much care with a broader community. And I know also that there are ways that that community can be in this room with us. And each of these projects that I've seen, at least, I'm thinking of Colony of Citizens, I keep calling it Colony of Crisis. Also thinking about bringing people in via Skype, and this conference has been very intentionally digital and Black about making sure that technology is available for people who cannot be present. But I wonder about the ways that one of the spin-offs of a space like this can be an opportunity or a conference space or a retreat or a working, not quite workshop, but working space where those projects, collectives who are working explicitly with the community and those who are in the function of administrators or collaborators or team members can come together in a way that the team members, particularly ones who are associated with the academy, can get some of the work and share resources and maybe get some of their own understanding of bias, of social justice, of various these kind of ethical frameworks where they can begin to share that work and how they have been able to bring that labor into the academy and corrupt the academy system in the way that needs to be. And those communities can also themselves come together and think about what are we asking of the academics who want to research with us, what do we need as resources, maybe we need rest in this space also. So I'm wondering about the ways that a spin-off can happen where it's like an administrators, organizers, sort of dual conference workshop space, fully funded, of course. I'm not sure if there are funders in the room.
Can I speak 30 seconds to that?
Fully funded, especially for those who are organizers. But it makes me think about the ways that we ask, and I'm going to be very explicit. People of color often ask white people to get themselves together, but there's also ways that we have a lot of privilege in this room, and those who have privilege, even though we are on the tiny, tiny outside in the academy, we also have so much work that we ourselves have to do.
Yes.
What are the ways that we can come together to do that work and also bring those people who are working with the community can come together and do whatever work they've got to do? Like what ways do folks who are organizing in Black Lives Matter, Philly, or wherever, how can they come together and just get some space to do that work? And I think organizer spaces do that with varying degrees of success, but like we have like traditions from Highlander to Song of folks who get together and get the training to keep on doing the work. That actually made the point where we're at. We have come together in this space to be Black and digital. Now how do we come together and be even more intentional about the justice part, about frameworks that we create, and also the leveraging of resources? So I was wondering what kind of ideas people had on.
Okay, why don't we open that up and then come back to the...
Yeah.
Dasha, did you want to?
I want to speak to it a little bit briefly about the conference that I was part of that ran at Western University, which is London, Ontario, which is a smaller city, kind of off the beaten track. And that happened in May last year. In fact, I made an extra effort to make sure that we had the colored conventions at that conference. The conference was called Organizing Equality. It was an international conference, and it actually took 4, 5, maybe even 6 years to... When was Occupy? What year was Occupy?
7 years ago.
So
8 years ago. 8 years ago.
2011. So it was born out of Occupy. The folks in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies where I was had been heavily engaged with Occupy. And as a faculty, they came together, and they came together in cross-collaboration with other faculties and other departments to say, hey, let's have a conference that's actually about this. And then they had to fight and fight and fight. Everybody knows the fights. Lots of money was being given to all the STEM-based projects, departments, and initiatives, and new faculties being born, and all this kind of stuff. And they managed to maneuver the money, and then they couldn't spend it because they were still being harassed. And it took them all that time to come to this conference. And when I joined as a co-organizer, I suggested that we don't have that traditional conference where people come together and they're so passionate and they feel so good about connecting, but then where do you take it? So I suggested, why don't we set this up as an organizing effort and bring in Black Lives Matter Toronto and bring in so and so and so and so, and have sessions within the conference where we talk about organizing and solidarity, and where do we do that exact collaboration. It was an experiment. It didn't work terribly well. There were unfortunate, I mean, it wasn't Black specific, and I think that will handle a lot of those things. But I completely agree with your analysis and your framing of what is absolutely necessary. I think it is so necessary, especially as there's so many people who understand the value of what is happening in Black scholarship and don't want it to reside and remain within the four walls of any particular academic institution. Now, the challenges of doing this kind of a project are that you want to be able to do this locally. It's difficult to do it on a broad stroke scale. And then how does the funding come in a local fashion, right? So all hands on deck, all hats in the circle to try and think this kind of thing through and how to make it happen resource-wise.
I was in LA before.
Sorry,
Oh,
yes.
so or not, or I want to go back there. We'll talk later.
So we'd like to thank the panelists for an exciting So we have a few announcements to make sure that you take your personal items and your trash with you. There's trash receptacles outside the room. There's also snacks that you can grab when you leave outside the room. Make sure you order your adjunct t-shirts. And finally, we have our closing plenary at the Frederick Douglass statue, which is across the campus, actually just across the street at the Hornbeck Library. So we look forward to seeing you at the next panel. Thank you so much. Thank you.